Alright, this is going to be a video tutorial about starting the drawing steps of your character style sheet. If you have not done the first three parts of this unit on Google Classroom, you should probably pause this video and go back and do those, as they're going to really help you understand some of the terms that I'll be talking about and the techniques I'll be using in this drawing. When we're all done with our character style sheet, we're going to want to end up with something that looks a little bit like this. So a single piece of paper with three separate drawings on it. You're going to have your character in a standing pose where we can see their entire body, and then you're going to put your character's portrait in two different orientations. What I've done is a straight on view and a 3/4 view, but you could also do a profile view, or if you really want to challenge, you could have their portrait looking up or down or some combination of angles. All right, before I even started drawing, the first thing that I really needed to do was go online and find a couple good references for the style that I wanted to replicate. You had an assignment to do that, so in your Google Doc, there should be a couple pictures of characters from the show or the comic that you're interested in copying, and you also should have looked at those pictures and figured out what proportions the artists were using. In my case, my artist was using 6.5 heads for their characters. So when I started drawing, I made sure I was following proportions that would cause my character to come out exactly 6.5 heads tall. All right, so I've got a blank paper. I'm ready to start drawing. Before I do anything, I kind of want to make some light lines that show where I'm going to put different elements of my character style sheet. So I know I need half of the page for their standing pose and half of the page for their heads. And those portraits, those heads, I'm going to take that side and divide it in half again, just so I have room for each version. So the measurements don't really matter. You can kind of estimate an eyeball for this part. You just want to make sure that when you're drawing, you have enough room to fit everything and you don't run out of space or have to scrunch your character up really small. And now I'm going to take a look at my reference that I found. So online, I'm looking at a picture I'd like to try and copy or work in the style of, and I measured up what proportions the artist used, and it turns out I'm going to be working with 8.5 heads for my proportions. So 8.5 heads have to fit in this area of the page, right? So I've got my character standing up, which means however big my head is, it needs to fit 8.5 times here, or I'll run out of space. So I'm going to just make a little mark so I know where kind of the top of the page is. I don't want to go right up to the edge, so I'm just making a light mark here to kind of let me know to stop here so I have a little bit of empty space. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom of the paper, probably right around here, and this is just to let me know I don't want the feet to go past this space or I'm going to be kind of crowded. So 8.5 heads have to fit here. So you got to take your ruler or your straight edge and just by trial and error figure out what size of head is going to fit in this space 8.5 times, or if you have another proportion, however many times your style is using. So I worked with my ruler and found out that this was the size head I needed to make if I was going to fit it 8.5 times in between the top and the bottom of my page. So now I'm going to draw some light lines. This is going to help me as I'm working on my drawing kind of know where I am. So I can look at these lines and say, oh, you know, I'm on the 3rd head down, or I'm almost to the 7th head. And there'll be sort of like a map or a guideline for me as I'm drawing. I'm putting these lines in pretty light because I know at the end of this I'm going to want to erase them, and if I draw them really dark, that's going to be more difficult. Hopefully you guys can see them on the camera even though they're so light. So here's my 8th head. I said I was using 8.5 heads as my proportion, and then kind of my feet, the bottom of my feet, the soles of my feet are going to be on this last little line right here. Okay? All right, so I've set up the area where I can draw my character's standing pose, and I'm ready to just start looking at my reference and putting that character into this little space. Your area that you set up might look a little bit different than mine. If your character is 3 heads tall, then you're going to have really big spaces and a lot less of them. So, depending on what your proportions are, you can expect your paper to look a little bit different than mine. All right, here I'm going to switch to a bigger piece of paper just because it's easier for me to see what I'm doing through the camera if it's a little bit bigger. But it's the exact same setup I had before. I've got 8 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm sorry, 8.5 spaces. And I'm going to start drawing and trying to fit my character into these spaces, matching my reference. One thing you might want to notice while I'm drawing is how many times I start over or erase something or change something or have to move something. If that's happening to you, it's not something you should be worried about. That is going to be part of the process as we draw this sort of challenging type of subject. All right, all I've started doing is putting down really simple geometric lines and shapes right now to block out where the various pieces of this character's body are supposed to go. I would really try hard during this step to keep your pencil lines pretty light. You're going to have to move things around and change things a lot as you do this step. And if you start drawing really dark lines, they're going to be pretty hard to erase, and your drawing's going to stop and take a look at what I've drawn so far. Before I move on and before I get to the more complicated parts of the drawing, I would want to look at these simple shapes and make sure they look right. If there's anything that I need to move around or change, this is a really easy time to do that. Once I start putting in little details, I want to be sure that those details are going in the right place and that they're the right size and that they relate to the rest of the picture in the correct way. So this is a great time to stop, step back from your artwork, take a look at it, and try to locate and correct any of those mistakes that you might have made while you were drawing. Alright, so now I've made some of those simple shapes a little bit more complex, but I still was really careful to keep my pencil lines light. There were a couple things I needed to fix. Down at the feet, some things were a little bit out of position. I may need to even go back and do some more to the legs and the feet area. But I'm going to start moving into some of the smaller details, some of the finer details, and check back in with you guys once I've made a little bit more progress. All right, right now I'm going to start going on to kind of the next stage of this drawing, which is cleaning it up, adding details. I'm going to go ahead and erase some of these sketchier lines and replace them with cleaner, smoother lines. Before I do that, I just want to point out that you probably noticed these shoulders gave me a little bit of an issue when I was drawing. I really did have to erase them quite a few times and redraw them and reposition them. I think that's probably because in one of the earlier steps, I rushed when I was drawing those simple shapes and simple lines. Something was not in the right place, and I wasn't being careful enough to notice it. It really gave me some issues in this part of the drawing. So it's definitely, I know the early steps are not always the most exciting part of the drawing, but if you spend a little time with them, they'll make the rest of your project a lot easier. So I ran into that problem. I just thought I'd point that out before I move on to the rest of the drawing. All right, so after working for a little bit, this is where my drawing ended up, and it is very close to being done. I'm probably at the stage in this drawing where I want to start thinking about finishing touches. Finishing touches could include going in and adding really, really small details. For me, it probably will also include going in and cleaning up some of these messier lines, tidying up some of the places where it's a little bit sketchy. But before I do any of those finishing touches, the most important thing that I need to do is put this drawing away for a little bit. So what I don't want to do is work on it so long that it becomes hard for me to see the mistakes that I'm making. When you get to this step in your drawing, I would strongly suggest that you do the same thing. Take it, put it away, and go do something else for a little while. You could come back to it the next day or even longer than that. When you come back to it after a break, you will see things more clearly. You will recognize things that you didn't notice when you were drawing, and it will give you sort of a fresh start to go in and put those finishing touches on. So when you get to this step, take a break. That's a great time to send a picture of it to me on Google Classroom or by email and get some feedback. You can also get feedback from, friends. You can send a photo to a friend and ask them how it looks. But the most important thing is that before you move on, you're going to give it a little bit of time and you're going to give yourself a little bit of a break. So the next part of the drawing that I'll be tackling on video will be the two heads. I'm going to post that next week so that you all have a little bit of time to tackle the standing pose and contact me, communicate with me about how it's going. And when we're all sort of at a finishing stage for the standing pose, I will go ahead and post a video for the rest of the character sheet. So I hope this video was helpful. If you have questions, comments, leave them. I'll be checking the post so that I can answer questions you guys have about the drawing. And I think what I'll do between now and the next video is I'll work up another version of this character in a completely different style. So I've done kind of a Dragon Ball Z style, and I've done Batman comic book style. If you guys have a style you'd like to see me try this character in, leave a comment, and I'll post how it turns out before we start the next step.